The Old Testament forms about 4/5 of the Christian Bible. It's the part of the Bible that was written before the time of Jesus, and it's got an important position in any kind of understanding of the Bible as a whole. It starts off with 5 books which form the law of Moses, sometimes call it the Pentateuch, 5 books, and it's followed by a history of Israel, which starts off with the creation, but goes on through the patriarchs and gives us the whole history up to about 420 BC. And there are books in it which are the individual writings of separate prophets, which give us the main message of the Old Testament. And the Old Testament is important because it shows us what God is like. It talks about the Messiah, an important figure to come, who is absolutely crucial in the purpose of God and who we can identify with the Lord Jesus Christ. And it gives us a background which allows us to understand the New Testament. Without the Old Testament, our understanding of the New Testament is going to be very, very shaky. So the Old Testament is quite important to us. Let's think about the general picture of how the Old Testament was written. It's a time chart. It goes back. There's the time of Jesus at the right-hand side of the screen, down to the time of Abraham, 2,000 years before then. So the time between Jesus and Abraham is about the same as the time between us and Jesus. It covers a long period of time. During that time, we have the history of Israel written down for us in the Old Testament. We have a set of periods where Israel did different things. Starts off with them as slaves in Egypt, or as the patriarchs before that, nomads in Canaan. There's a period when they're in Egypt. They start off as a small number, 70 people go down to Egypt. They become a large nation, but also they're enslaved. They escape from Egypt, and you get the Exodus, which is the occasion where there's a miracle and they manage to escape from the Egyptians by crossing the bed of the Red Sea while the waters go back. They're then ruled by judges, a bit like kings, but they don't form a dynasty. They don't go on to have their children rule, and sometimes there's no ruler at all. The great kings of Israel, and then Israel divides into 2 nations. Israel itself, which is the northern kingdom and is ruled by a collection of very bad kings, and then a rather smaller Judah, which is ruled by the house of David, and keeps on going until Israel is taken away captive by the Assyrians. Judah is taken captive by the Babylonians, but they return, and there's another period when they live in the land of Canaan, now called Judea, and the Old Testament ends 420, 430 BC, somewhere around that time, although the Jews, as they're now called, carry on living in the land of Judea up to the time of Jesus, until the Romans take away the people in 70 AD, and the war which went from 66 to 74. The books there fit into that history quite closely. So the books of Moses were written shortly after the Exodus, either by Moses or by scribes working for Moses. They contain the words that Moses did and the actions of Moses, as well as the law of God. Other books are written by individual prophets, usually at a single time. So the book of Isaiah, for example, is written by one prophet who lasts from the reign of Uzziah through into the reign of Hezekiah, and so on. Jeremiah and Ezekiel are rather shorter periods. Proverbs I've put in the reign of Solomon, but actually has other bits of the collection added later on. The big exception to this is Psalms. Psalms is a collection of a large number of different hymns to God. Some of them may be written as early as the Exodus. Some of them are written as late as the period of captivity in Babylon, and a whole lot in between during the reign of David the king, probably by David the king. So that's the picture that we get. That's the conventional picture of the chronology of the Old Testament. And there are two theories basically of how the Old Testament is written. There's the standard theory I've been using so far, and that supposes that the history that's written in the Bible is an accurate representation of what actually happened. The books are written just like we saw them in the previous slide, and the history books written maybe a little later, but they're compiled from ancient records. You've got a genuine picture of what actually happened, written not too long after the events themselves, and the books are built up, at least for the king's part of it. Chronicles probably written a bit later, but still from ancient records. But there's another theory that developed in the 19th century, really, people like Julius Wellhausen and the Tübingen School of theologians. And this basically puts the Bible written a much later time. It's compiled in a period from the Babylonian period to the time that the Greeks ruled the Middle East. Although the idea is that some fragments of ancient writings were incorporated in that, and the whole thing was edited, rewritten, and so on until it reached its final form, partly in the Persian period, partly in the Greek period. Other books were written as well according to this theory, and they were looked at, and the whole lot was decided as to which will be in the Old Testament and which will be rejected at the end of the 1st century AD. So there's a standard theory. We saw it before. We have a Bible written from shortly after 1450 BC up until 413. That's the Old Testament there, with different prophets writing their books at the time. According to the critical theory, though, things go on into the period of the ancient empires. So the main part of writing starts off right at the end of the Babylonian period, but carries on through the sort of Persian Empire, and the final form of the books is decided during the Greek period, and even as the Romans are arriving in the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean. Although the theory does say, well, yes, there are one or two fragments that are taken from a little bit earlier on, and there were books that were edited together earlier on, but the whole process is edited and re-edited and really represents a set of beliefs from the Persian and Greek periods rather than something which was reliably written by contemporaries earlier on in the process. The earliest traditions that are supposed to have been included would come from about 1000 BC, so that's another 400 years after the Exodus. And the whole lot was put together according to the critical theory at the Council of Jamnia, which is supposed to have happened in the 80s AD. There's a problem with it, which is that there's no record of any such council anywhere. It's just an entire guess that that council actually took place at all. Well, which of those is the proper understanding of how the Old Testament was put together is quite important, and we need to base that on evidence, not just on supposition. So what kind of evidence could we have? Well, historical accuracy. If the accounts are accurate, then that looks like the standard theory is the normal way of putting it. So that in the traditional picture, the standard picture, we'd expect a fair amount of historical accuracy. The critical picture, we wouldn't expect much accuracy because, after all, the things are edited and re-edited centuries after the event, and we'd expect hardly any accuracy at all. We'd expect a lot of errors to have crept in. And we can test that. We can put together archaeological findings. We can look at undesigned coincidences. We can see whether the picture we have in the Old Testament fits the history correctly or not. Language, that's quite an interesting one, because languages change with time, and we can determine the date by looking at the language that's in use. And not only that, different authors have different styles, and we can look at the styles and we can try and work out whether we've got a very condensed set of styles like you'd expect with a late set of books produced by a group of editors late on in the period, or whether we have a lot of different people writing at different times. So we're going to look at styles, and one of the things that goes on, it passes for linguistic analysis, is a look at the names by which God is referred to. We'll come back to that. And of course, the sort of smoking gun, if we can find it, is a set of manuscripts. When are the earliest manuscripts? Of course, it's a bit of a problem because manuscripts are fragile. The absence of manuscripts doesn't tell you very much. A papyrus roll would disappear quite quickly if it was kept in wet conditions, as the area has. So a century or two, and it would begin to rot away. But even a parchment document, if it wasn't kept in a dry library, would rot away fairly rapidly, and we wouldn't still have very early manuscripts of the Old Testament. So let's look at the archaeology. Let's see what the archaeology tells us. Well, from the time of Jesus going back to really the 8th century BC, we have so many finds that there's no point in even trying to chart them on a chronological map. They're just lots and lots of them. There's no doubt that the history we have in the Old Testament is accurate history. We get back to the reign of Hezekiah, about 700 BC. And again, we actually have a lot of evidence for this. I've just put one thing up, a document. Probably 4 copies were buried. 3 of them are in existence in different museums. And that's an account of one of Sennacherib's 5 of Sennacherib's campaigns, but one of them is in Judea, in Judah, and it's a fight against Hezekiah. And the account of Sennacherib's campaign fits exactly with what we have in the Bible. Particularly, he devastates the land of Judah, but he's unable to capture Jerusalem. He just besieges it, and then he goes home. And the picture that we have of that time in the Old Testament, we have lots of bits of evidence which match up to the archaeological evidence as well. So there's absolute accuracy going back this far. Go a bit earlier, still plenty of evidence. Again, I'm going to pick out the odd piece to show. That's the Moabite stone. That's an account of a war between Moab and Judah and Israel. And the war ends up with Moab gaining independence from Israel, which had dominated up to that point. And the account we have on the Moabite stone is from the Moabite point of view, and it includes a description which fits exactly with the description in the Bible. So again, accuracy is there. We have an accurate picture of history going back that far. One of the things that has been very much queried by skeptical archaeologists, I suppose you'd better call them skeptical scholars, is the existence of the King David. He's the one that's marked out, his reign marked out in blue there. And that was doubted very much, but no sooner had the books that were critical of the idea of David being published than they discovered this set of stones here, fragments of an inscription left by the king of Syria, which refers to him defeating the kings of Israel and Judah. The king of Judah is described as the king of the house of David. It's a description which tells you that David exists. It's about 2 centuries, maybe only 150 years, depending on the exact dating of the reign of David itself. So it would be like having an account now of the existence of Queen Victoria. It's not too long earlier, and we had a definite description of David as the founder of the dynasty that was ruling Judah. So David is an established fact. It gets more awkward before then because there's basically everything's older, but also because Israel is a semi-nomadic people and they don't leave as much archaeological evidence. Mostly they leave tent peg holes and footprints. You get a gradual growth of Israelite settlements, Israelite houses in the area, and you get a diminution in the number of pig bones found. The Israelites didn't eat pork, so they didn't kill pigs to eat them, and so there's no pig bones, whereas the Canaanites did eat pigs, and so you can see the Canaanites fading out and being defeated by the Israelites. But the earliest reference to the nation of Israel that we have is from on this stele here, which is the stele of the Pharaoh Mereneptah, and he refers to a campaign he ran in Canaan, in which he says that he has destroyed Israel, its seed is no more, and the description of Israel, it's spelt out in hieroglyphics along with an identifier, which identifies it as a people, possibly a nomadic people, and it's a sort of plural people. It's several tribes which make this nation up, which is what how the Bible describes Israel. Before that time, we have really circumstantial evidence. We have evidence of the destructions in about 1400 BC in the land of Canaan, which correspond to the Israelites coming in and occupying the land. We have the description of the geography of the time, of the customs that are carried out. It fits, but we don't have the actual physical artifacts very much that we can put together. But the archaeology that we have matches the picture of the Bible. We have apparent historical accuracy. So we've looked at this archaeological evidence. It shows that helps us to see how the Old Testament was written. There's a lot more evidence, but am I making a good case so far? Let me know in the comments to the video, and if you've got a question or something, we'll try and answer it. Let's go on. Let's look at a different kind of evidence. This is the evidence of undesigned coincidences. Now, an undesigned coincidence is an occasion where we get tiny details in the account which are independent of one another and which give us a picture of an underlying truth that isn't there in the main narrative. So we have a sort of hidden narrative which is distinct from the main account. This is something that's really very difficult to invent. If there is going to be editing and re-editing, these are the things that get lost. And so the presence of undesigned coincidences is something which shows that we have an accurate account of something that really happened. Something as well that tells us that we have a proper account of what's going on. I want to just look at one of them. There are hundreds. This one goes back to the book of Joshua, and it's evidence of the spies going into Jericho. What happens is that Israel leaves Egypt. They for 40 years wander around in the desert before they come up the east side of the River Jordan, and they enter Canaan across the river. First fortress is Jericho, the city of Jericho, and there's a siege, very brief one, only about a week, at which point there's some kind of intervention by God, and the walls of Jericho fall down and they capture the city. But just before that, they send in spies to scout out the route and see what the opposition is like and make sure we don't get lost and all the rest of it. So that this Joshua, who is going to command the Israelites entering the land of Canaan, sends out two spies to see what the land is like. And the question that it's worth looking at here is, what time of year did this event take place? And, well, it's fairly obvious, because the spies go out at the beginning of the book of Joshua. Then Israel crosses into the promised land. Jericho is destroyed, and then they move on to Gilgal, where they celebrate the Passover. So the entry to the land is just before the Passover in the springtime. There's the account in Joshua chapter 2. The spies get to Jericho, they're spotted, they go to the house of Rahab, and she hides them while the king of Jericho's men come to find out where they are. They ask the woman, she says, no, they've gone away, and she hides them. And the wording is there, she brought them up to the roof and hid them with the stalks of flax that she laid out in order on the roof. Now, the important thing here is the timing when the flax would be on the roof. The point is that the flax harvest takes place a week or two, several weeks before the Passover, but not months before the Passover, only a short while before it. So it's not unsurprising that if this is the Passover time, there would be flax laid out to dry, ready for processing on the roof. And we actually have this thing here's the Giza calendar. It's an agricultural calendar that someone had written out shortly after this time, which says what happens in each month of the year, and we can see when the flax harvest was, and it is just before the Passover. So we've got this little tiny correspondence between two separate accounts, that they're independent accounts, they're talking about different things, and they tell you something that isn't there really in the main narrative. It's not part of it. So it tends to give us confidence that the accounts are correct. There are lots more of these. They're more impressive. This one's a particularly impressive one, but they also take a long time to go through. So I've picked the shortest rather than the most convincing. Language. Language changes with time, of course, and the language of the Old Testament changes. The language at the end of the Old Testament isn't the same as the language for the earliest books of the Old Testament. And if you look at the way the language develops, the language of the law of Moses is very standard classical Hebrew, but it is very classical Hebrew. It's early Hebrew. Whereas if you look in something like the book of Nehemiah, you've got a large chunk of Aramaic in it. It's written in the style of the 5th century BC, very much, or maybe the 4th century. So the change in language style is more marked with the later books than it is with the earlier books. In particularly, the style of the book of Deuteronomy is a style which seems to be preserved, sort of official Hebrew, right through the history of Samuel and Kings. Whereas Chronicles, it's a bit different. Interesting thing is things like the spelling of names changes with time, and you can date the books by looking at things like these spellings. The other point about the language is that different books in the Old Testament have different styles. So you've got something that's being edited by a committee, edited and re-edited, you'd expect the individual books to lose their individual styles and end up with a very similar style, but they don't. They have different styles. Again, there's a lot of speculation on this. Quite often what happens is the old way of comparing them was to pick on certain words and say, does that word appear in this book, does it appear in that book, does it appear in the other book? So Isaiah, for example, they say there are a lot of words that only appear in the first part, a lot of other words that appear in the second part, perhaps they're written by different people. Actually, what you've really got is a huge number of words that only appear once. And it seems that Isaiah had a very, very broad vocabulary, which he uses to the full. And the style of doing that is consistent throughout the whole of the book. So the critical model predicts that the book should have similar styles, but actually they have different styles. So again, there is evidence that shows the standard model is much more accurate than the critical idea. And the critics particularly picked on the name of God here, and they said, well, there were two different groups. Each of them used a different name of God. Each one wrote its own documents using its preferred name. Later on, those documents were collected together and edited together, and we get some documents that appear to have both names in, well, do have both names in. But the idea is these are amalgamated from other documents. And it's not until the Persian period that the Torah came together in the way that we now have. So how will we test whether that hypothesis is good? Well, if we can find a document from before about 650 BC, which contains both the main titles or names of God, then that would really knock over the critical theory on this particular point. And we have such a document. So there we go. There's the chronological chart. I've marked on it 650 BC. It's long before the stuff is edited together. If we can find documents before that time that have both the names of God, then the critical analysis has fallen over, and we have exactly such a document. It's around 1200 BC. It's a thing called the Mount Ebal curse tablet. It was found on Mount Ebal, and it pronounces curses on some unfortunate individual. And it uses both the name of God and it uses the title Elohim as well. So both of them are in use, not just a little bit before the lot was supposed to be edited together, but a long way before. So the critical theory on names seems to have fallen over. Other evidence, manuscripts. If we can find manuscripts that are earlier than the time set by the critical theory, then something is wrong with the critical theory. So the critical theory presumes that everything was put together, that the Old Testament was collected together into one second collection, one canon, at the Council of Jamnia, council which has no other record. Problem, we got the Dead Sea Scrolls. Dead Sea Scrolls go back to the 3rd century BC, towards the end of that century, and they were buried in 68 AD. So we know they were definitely buried before any possible Council of Jamnia. And the way that the scrolls were written, you can tell the difference between books that are supposed to be Bible and books that are supposed not to be Bible. So the things that they already knew were scripture are written in one way, and there is a different marked way where things are written if they're not considered to be part of the collected Bible. And the collection we've got is almost exactly the same as the one that we have in our current Bibles. The only thing that's missing is that the book of Esther, we haven't found any scrolls of Esther in the collection that the Dead Sea Scrolls have. Apart from that, we've got the same canon as the standard Hebrew canon that we have nowadays. So the idea that the canon was decided at the Council of Jamnia goes, we know that it was already accepted before 200 BC. Interesting to see. According to the critical theory, they were still working out what the books were. Well, the canon was decided according to the Dead Sea Scrolls before that. We also have a thing called a Septuagint. That's a translation of the Old Testament into Greek. That's not very strong evidence, because while it certainly would hold for the early books of the Bible, the first 5 books, the translations were added to and altered over and over again as time went on, and so it's not clear whether a particular book was added to the collection later or whether it's part of the original translation. So it doesn't help us a lot, except with the first 5 books of the Bible. We know that they were already in existence at the start of the 3rd century BC. What we do have, though, is a couple of fragments from about 700 BC. These are dug up in the Ketef Hinnom excavations, a tomb, and they are 2 rolled up pieces of silver. And they allude to, pretty well exactly quote from, various passages from the Bible. And this one here, the second scroll, the easy one to read, has the priestly blessing from Numbers 6. This one here, which is a little more indistinct, contains a reference to Deuteronomy 7 verse 9 and to Numbers chapter 6, the priestly blessing again. According to critical theory, the priestly blessing, part of the P document, wasn't written until at least the Babylonian period and probably the early Persian period. Deuteronomy is supposed to not have been written before about 600 BC, and yet here they are on manuscripts a century before the Deuteronomy is supposed to be written, and perhaps 2 centuries before the Numbers passage is supposed to have been written. Again, it's very strong evidence that the Bible existed a lot earlier than the critical theory says, but it's perfectly consistent with the standard model. So the critical theory says Numbers and Deuteronomy were written separately from one another, so they shouldn't both appear on the same scroll at this early stage, and they were written later than this by at least a century in any case. So it's a deadly blow. The critical model is having problems. So let's just review the evidence we've seen. The evidence we've got does not support the critical model, but it does support the standard model. It looks very much as though the standard model as to how the Old Testament was written is in fact correct. The critical model isn't supported by the evidence. So we've got this picture of a book or a collection of books which was written over a period of about 1,000 years, starting at about 1400 BC, ending at about 400 BC. What's interesting about it is that it is consistent. It contains the same teaching at the start as it does at the end. It refers to the figure of the Messiah at the start, and at the end it's teaching about life after death. Doesn't change. It's teaching about the nature of God. Doesn't change. It's got a single consistent message. And I'll leave you to think, why would a book written by many different people over a hugely spread out period of time be so consistent unless it has one mind behind it, one mind that is greater than any human being could possibly be? Well, I hope you enjoyed that video. I hope you found it informative. If you did, please hit the like button. Let us know what you thought of it in the comments section below, and we release videos on similar topics every week, so look out for more. Try subscribing to the channel and take a look at our website for more information, and may God bless you always.